On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Ross Desmond. He is the head of software at Butlr. We're going to be talking about building teams that can make fast decisions. I think Ross has some great viewpoints on this. He's seen different environments, different drivers for growth, when you should hire, and how you empower those teams. I think we're going to get a bunch of examples and stories, which I'm excited to hear. And Ross, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Let's start off at the top. Get two things out of the way so everyone knows who you are and who Butlr is. So if you could tell everyone what Butlr does and some of your responsibilities as head of software, we'll dive on in.
Perfect. Well, Butlr is the world's first and only 100% wireless, anonymous people counting and occupancy sensing platform. But what that really means is how can we use data in our real estate to help drive our occupancy and utilization of our space. So that way we can make sure that we're maybe the most productive or the most comfortable as we start to move forward in 2023. And so I'm head of software for Butlr. And what that means is I handle all front-end API and back-end services, as well as some of the software architecture of how the entire system plays together.
Awesome. I mean, I think we could dive into an episode talking about what you guys do, because it seems like a pretty cool product, but different topic, different day. This episode, I know we'll be talking about building teams that can make fast decisions. I guess before we dive in, let's actually maybe just talk about what that means, because I think it could mean so many different things. It could go so many different ways. And I think, to start the podcast off, I'd like to kind of get your thoughts on, we're talking about making fast decisions within engineering teams. What are fast decisions and what decisions need to be made quickly?
Yeah, so decisions kind of come with this problem scope. And that problem scope is directly related to decision making and going fast. So an example is a scope might be fixing a bug. Well, if it's within my system, then it's pretty easy. And I could probably do that within an hour or two and get that system deployed. But if the bug were, say, across multiple systems or across teams, that starts to increase the velocity or decrease the velocity and increase the amount of time spent just trying to get a handle of that bug and then being able to deploy and solve that problem. And this goes from bugs to features. It can go all the way into architecture decisions. And we start to slow the speed of our team as we start to increase how many stakeholders and how many others that we actually interact with. And then finally, what's it like to deploy a system and how interconnected that system might be really decreases the speed at which we can start to make improvements for our customers.
Absolutely. And I guess, a couple of things you said in there. Obviously, your system. That's different than being involved with a problem that needs a decision that you're not necessarily involved in. As a head of software, obviously you see across systems, you have different teams that handle different problems. Some problems might span different teams. As you're kind of looking at that and you're trying to make sure that you're building a team that can make a fast decision, when you're looking at that architecture, that team design, where do you start to make sure, like right off the ground? And I guess, you're part of a startup. You have that opportunity to, build things a little bit differently versus more established. And I know you worked at Amazon, which is different, career path, different environment. But when you're looking at a startup and you're looking at wanting to build these teams that can make fast decisions, obviously within the scope of what they're doing, what are some of the things that, you try to put in place?
Yeah. So we can kind of go back to simple object-oriented programming. When we think about our system as a whole, we need to define the boundaries between each subsystem. And it's important that we define boundaries both in terms of what other communications we have between other subsystems, but also who the customer is for that boundary. So an example we might have here is in robotics or in IoT, where I've previously worked, we have data coming up from our subsystem that's on-premise. Well, we need to be able to ingest that and work and chew that data, enrich it, enhance it, and get that into our data lakes. So if we were to define that problem and just draw a box around it and say, okay, this is our backend and no customer can touch it, and no one external except for these two teams, which is this hardware team on the ground and maybe the API team, what I can do is I can bound my problem. I don't need to solve customer problems in there. And so that allows me to reduce the number of teams and the number of interactions that team may have to work with. And so it's important to basically take all of your hardware, all of the paths that this software can go through, that this data can travel, and then try to circle it. And if that piece touches more customers, you're going to increase the decision radius that you have to make and therefore decrease the velocity. And so it's important that when you start to see these connections, extra connections come in, hey, can we do this? Can we touch this back end for the customer? It's important that a little red light goes off and says, okay, well, now I'm increasing the sphere. So any bugs that occur there are now going to be a direct correlation with those customers. And that gives us less freedom to upgrade that system.
So problem scope, I guess, it's interesting, obviously, how you draw that circle. That circle will expand. That problem scope, as it gets wider, the velocity obviously has to shrink because you're going to impact more people. There's more moving parts. When you're looking at teams and at their granular level, obviously everyone wants to empower teams, but obviously, as this problem scope grows and you have to slow velocity down, make sure everyone understands that. How do you kind of coordinate that with the team? Because I think on one hand, we want teams to move really fast, on their own, be empowered. On the other hand, they need to be aware when something's out of scope, something's bigger than they are, and then we need to slow down. It's not always cut and dry.
It's not always cut and dry. And that's completely true, especially when the needs of the business kind of come in. And so you have to ask yourself a question. Am I increasing the scope of this current product to do something that it was not designed to do? And if the answer is yes, then you have to slow down in order to go fast. If the answer is no, then we can start to draw some bounds. We can say, okay, well, actually, let's create a separate, smaller system that acts as a buffer between our customer and our back-end system. So start to decide, basically making decisions that separate responsibility and using the group to do so. And so now you're talking about, well, how do we speed up or slow down? So we can talk about velocity being related to scope and decision-making. When we think about the scope or the size of the problem and every subsystem and stakeholder or customer that increases that size from what we originally perceived it to be, we need to then say, well, we now have this system that has increased and we have to decide, who do I talk to in this scenario? And so something like building habits, some of the books that we've read on how to build a habit, building triggers, that's all part of this. So we have to build a trigger. And your trigger, and my trigger that I define with my teams pretty easily in our charter, is the time it takes, I think it will take to solve the problem. And so with software engineers, we can kind of distill a little rule that I have, which is if an engineer says it's going to take 1 day, it's going to take 3. If it's going to take 3 days, it's going to take a week. If it's going to take a week, it's going to take 3 weeks. So with that, armed with that information, you can also assume the size of the problem. And so what we do in our team charters, and I make sure that every one of my teams does this, is that we break down the problem, and we have a decision-making clause. When can I make a decision? And then what other customers, stakeholders, or people do I need to bring in based on that size of that decision? And so for a 1 hour decision, which in my role takes a day, you can do that yourself. If it's a day, you're going to want to check in with your team. You might need to implement something early on, especially if it's a young team. You have to have a template. Let's make a template. Show me what the problem is and how you plan on solving this problem and anything else you've considered. Small, short and sweet, less than a page, but that'll give you some information about where the team's at in their decision making. And then once it goes to a week, that's a whole team decision. Maybe it brings in your senior, your team lead, ensure that that's working. And then as soon as it's a week, that requires a high-level design document and maybe a technical design document. Usually when it's a week, the engineering effort might be only a week, but upgrade, rollout, and impact are significantly higher.
It's interesting. I think I think you mentioned the team charter. Is this something formal? Is this something that is just kind of discussed? Is it tribal knowledge? I mean, maybe you just give us a little insight into that would be great.
Yeah, so actually I'm looking at one right now. We have our API and front-end team charter. I pulled those two together. The teams are actually separate. I have an API team and a front-end team. They do some cross-compatibility, but otherwise they're separate. But the reason I bring them in for this charter is that they're small and that they need to know who to talk to when they make decisions. And API and front-end, well, they're hand in hand. So we need to make sure that they understand how to make decisions together and they've agreed upon it. So we go through and we have a meeting. Usually it's really fun. We do a summary together. We go over what that team owns. We put our customers in. So who do we do this for? And our customers aren't just Butlr customers. There are other developers. There are install techs. And there are also managers like myself, because I need to know how I need to communicate with my customers should something happen. Then we go through our team norms, how we work cross communication, what does on-call look like, and then finally, how do we make decisions? And in this role, we say, well, when do we make individual decisions, team decisions, and also how do I present my ideas to the team and beyond? So we go through all of this, and usually in this area, I give one thing that I see based on the team dynamics. And sometimes that's a kind of a story that we can start to talk about in a little bit. I think I have something prepared from teaching martial arts. But this is a very important thing. It's being able to give a specification that helps drive the team. So it's like a team tenet. But you want to make sure that from a management perspective, you're not telling the team where to go. You're giving them a central idea to start building off of. And for startups, the build, measure, learn philosophy is one of those really good ones, making sure that we are learning every time we deploy something. And so in this case, when I arrived, we had no metrics on what our customers were actually utilizing in our system. And so that was the first thing that we implemented, was how do we get that feedback loop? And now we're deploying faster, understanding our customers better. And that was one of the original driving factors I added to that team charter.
Oh, that's awesome. And the team charter, is it, do you have a tool you're keeping it in? Is it just, a pure document, or how do you actually maintain that repository of team charters?
Yeah, so this one, I have a Notion. It's only, each team has their own team charter, and I look through them and work with them. And these are also living documents. They change, and every time we have a new person on, we get to do this again. Usually it's a lot smaller, but also things change over the course of even the last 6 months I've been here.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, because I think that's the one thing that I was going to wonder is, like, as the team charter is built and how quickly you go back, and obviously you mentioned every time you hire somebody new. I guess as an example, you mentioned you have either the front end and the API team are smaller teams. There's one charter; they're very related. What happens when they got to grow up and separate, and then you need two team charters, and obviously the impact on other customers, other teams that interact with that front end or API team?
Yeah. One thing I've had to do is we separate the team charter, but we ensure that in the decision-making portion, we go and we talk to those teams that we're going to work with. And for us, we're an API-first company. So we're not only creating APIs for the front end, we are creating APIs that work for our customer. And so it's important that we bifurcate those and have two different customers with maybe two different ways to go about that problem. And usually that's up to us on our leadership teams on which one do we solve maybe first, or how do we make sure that both those customers are being kept in the loop and working appropriately. So this is all part of that decision-making piece.
Interesting. You said something I remembered. I was like, I got to come back to, because you said something about a martial arts example, and it's been sitting in the back of my head out of curiosity. And I was like, I got to ask you before I forget.
Yeah. So this comes to, like, how do we empower people to make that happen in the first place?
Absolutely.
People, especially when our problems start to increase in velocity. So, like, I have this mental model, and the mental model is the velocity of the solution being implemented is inversely proportional to the speed at which that circle increases and the diameter of that circle. So oftentimes for a junior engineer, they come in, I can solve this problem 100%. And then all of a sudden you add a customer on top of it. And they go, oh, well, I'm like a little bit nervous. I'm not sure if this is going to, like, how bad this is going to impact them. But then you add another stakeholder, or you add a subsystem that's not quite working appropriately that you have to upgrade. And then you reach stall point. And so depending on the level of the experience of the engineer involved and the size of the scope creep from the initial mental model of what the solution is, you reach a stall point. And so us as leaders, how do we make sure and empower people that they can push past that and that they have the resources? And so this is important for us as leaders. So as in martial arts, I grew up in Chelmsford, Massachusetts, where I had a martial arts teacher who taught me how to teach. And I was young at the time. And I would say I was probably around 11 or 12 when he started teaching me how to instruct. And one thing that's stuck with me is no matter the age group you work at, depending on the level of interaction and how excited they are, you as an instructor have to be either on one end of the spectrum or on the other. You have to find where they are. And then if you want to elevate them, you need to be higher. And if you need to bring them slower, you need to be slower. And so it's important that we don't, as leaders, don't just set the example at exactly what we want, because they're never going to get to exactly what you want if you're there. It's like that. It's like a Taylor series approximation. We don't ever get there if that happens. And so what we need to do is be one up or one below. And so that includes on this team dynamic. So once we set those decision making, you as a leader have to start acting at that level. So if they act too fast and they try to get the solution out, you have to be acting as the person to slow them down. You know this is going to happen because you have a mental model about the size of this problem. You know that this deployment might reach 10 customers. You know that this person maybe jumps in and tries to deploy an entire solution. So the first thing I do is ask them, hey, what's the rollout plan? How do we expect to ensure that our customers are still going to be happy as this rolls out? And how do we know when to turn back? And so having them write up a rollout plan ends up going, oh, well, actually the solution needs to change because we don't have the ability to do this one thing yet. So I need to do this, then this. And so that slows them down. On the flip side, you have the junior engineer that might get kind of stalled. And so you got to provide a process for them to go through it. So I have this document that I had both at Amazon and here called How to Run a Software Project. I had to rewrite it again, but it's good because it helps me to think. But that one goes through and says, okay, I'm here. What do I need to do next? And it gives you kind of step-by-step instructions. Okay, well, today it's Friday on the week that I'm working on this project. I need to inform my stakeholders about where we are with this project. And then for them, for a junior engineer, you need to tell them what they need to inform on. And so it's important that you're informing on a milestone that actually impacts your customer. So there's all these different pieces, and you have to play that role depending on the personality of who you're working with.
I like that. I think it's such a realistic example. And I think anyone who's ever tried to teach somebody has come across people who you both need to speed up for or slow down for, which is interesting. I was thinking about my own daughter who's 9, and I was thinking about that same thing where sometimes I find myself trying to slow her down because I know she's missing something. As you're kind of looking, in your framework of, wanting to make the team get to decision point faster, obviously it sounds like that empowerment all the way down to the junior engineer even is super important because you have to make sure everyone trusts each other's decision-making, scaling of the problem in their mind. Because obviously you can't really trust somebody if everyone's scattered in a billion directions and you always have to feel like you need to, I guess, be responsible for their thought processes. I mean, there's a bottleneck there. As a leader, you can't have that.
Yeah, exactly. And if you put yourself in that process all the time at every stage, we can't possibly succeed. So we have to do, how to build a habit. You have to instill a trigger of when you should be called in. And that all depends on the experience of the engineer as well. And you can be a connector manager by installing a trigger to someone else as well. Like, hey, go talk to your senior engineer when you hit this stage, every time you hit this stage. Or, and something I tend to do is engineers that are really fast, I just say, give me your preferred solution and then give me 3 others that you've considered. And that may teach them something, or they might grow from that. And guess what? I get to grow from that. From every single engineer doing that, I learn, 20 new ways to do 10 different things. So it's been pretty nice.
Interesting. I guess the one thing that I want to touch on, because we're talking about faster decisions, we're talking about empowering employees, at different levels to make decisions. I think we have to talk about when things go wrong, because I think, that's the key is everyone can make a decision. The problem is people are worried about that accountability piece. And again, I'll use my 9-year-old. I tell her to go do something. If I react negatively and she's made a mistake, she might think, oh, making mistakes are bad. And a 9-year-old in her world, I could shift that. So I've got to be super careful. I feel like sometimes my wife and I are like walking up eggshells to make sure, hey, we want to make sure you understand it was okay. But how did you learn from it? What did you take away? As an engineering manager, you want fast decisions. You have this really interesting mental model of having people be able to be empowered. What do you do when something goes wrong? How do you help somebody understand the ramifications? I hate to use the word postmortem, but what happens?
And we do have those, right? We have COEs, we have cause of errors. So I do come from Amazon, and that process is pretty nice. The 5 whys is really important. We do it as a team, and it's really important that we tend not to call out names during that time. So we sit there and we go through, okay, what was the original cause of error? How did we end up here? Why did we even end up here? And when we made this decision, what other factors did we have? And so one thing that I always reiterate when our teams are going on call, which we are always, when the system is done, when we've solved it, I recap to our team members, what we learned, what we did, and I thank them for all the effort that they put in to kind of make this right. And that we make decisions, and while maybe some of them don't go out quite well, the response is also something we need to value. And so people sometimes get scared to make a decision, but if they know that I'll be there and our team will be there and we're doing this as a team, that also means they'll come to us before they make a decision sometimes, because they know that we'll be there when that happens and that we all want to work together. And so it really comes down to this just trust that we have to build. And that's part of the reason why I make sure that I'm on call when a lot of these things happen and I jump on. I don't need to control the situation, but an example is we had a server go down because of some thermal event, and it didn't affect any customer data, which was fantastic. But as we were doing it, we all got on there, and I didn't really need to be involved with the solution of the actual technical piece. Instead, what I did was I wrote up what was happening. I provided those updates into our channels that needed to be updated. Our business team knew, our engineering team knew what was going on so that they didn't jump onto an accidental impact from this event, and then summarized our impact at the end, and then thank the team for doing it publicly. So that's kind of part of where this comes into is we have to own and be public about what our engineers have done and how well they've done it. And then also talking about future proofing. And so in our one-on-ones afterwards, I'll go through and we'll talk about this. Yes, we made a mistake here. I really appreciate that we've mitigated this portion and we've future-proofed this portion. What would you do differently? And what maybe should I do as an engineering leader to get us all on the same page to make this not happen again? So it's really crafting that narrative.
That makes complete sense. And as you're kind of, I guess, that one-on-one piece, and you're asking, somebody what they think went wrong. I guess, what are you looking for there? Because I think obviously, sometimes there's going to be some, they're going to feel maybe embarrassed, or maybe it was a solution they easily missed. So there's a lot of emotion that goes with that, right? And I think it's sometimes hard. Everyone is unique. They'll take a loss differently. When you're going through that one-on-one, are you looking for something, or it's more of a guidance through that process for them? What happens?
Yeah, usually I'm looking for something when it's a junior engineer, because we've all been there. But how do you get them to know that we've all been there and not be in that moment where it's like, oh no. And yeah, that one's a really tough one. A lot of it comes down to being have you read the book Radical Candor? It's really about being direct about the point, and that it's not something that it's not personal. It's something that the way we think, it's about our process and how do we change that process. Yes, people definitely get defensive. I still get defensive. And now it's about recognizing that defense. Now I'm able to do that. And in engineers and junior engineers, it's, hey, let's pause this conversation for now. I understand that we're feeling a little bit, this has happened pretty close to us right now. So let's pause it and let's come back to it, because remember, we're on the same team. We work together and we just want to be here for each other. And then kind of leave it at that. Usually it comes up, actually. Most of the time, if I leave it there, I'll receive a Slack message, be like, hey, I was been thinking about what you said. Let's re-talk about it, because I'm interested in how I can grow here.
I like it. Ross, I mean, I think, it sounds like a pretty cool environment to be able to operate in. I like environments where, that empowerment and the accountability piece are disproportionate, meaning you want empowerment and the accountability. Yes, you have to take, but there's the consequence piece is missing. And I think a lot of times different orgs say it, but the consequence piece is all there. And you have people who are afraid to be empowered because they deep down know the culture is one of, we want blameless, but not really. Somebody still has to be held accountable. And it's like, that's difficult. I like how you said, you guys don't call out names. I think that is awesome.
Yeah. And you do have to be accountable. You're totally right. And that's something that it's really empowering to say, I am responsible for this piece. So instead of from an engineering leader saying you are, usually I'll say, hey, my mental model of the situation is that this system and this system are owned by this. Can you guys confirm? Can you confirm what you own? And when they say it, it's empowering. It also triggers how they will respond and think about the solution when it goes out as a reflection of yourself. But it's also important. My first manager at Amazon told me when I joined, he said, if you don't break anything within a month, I don't know what you're doing here. And I said, okay, fair point. I did end up taking down a warehouse for 30 minutes, which was like really scary and really embarrassing at 6 a.m. on a Monday. So I felt it. And then I've never felt like I needed to fix something so much after that. And it was really empowering. And so it comes back to that manager as well.
That's awesome. That's such a great story. I think if I was onboarding, I heard that, I'd be like, all right, there's not much worse that I could do than taking down the whole warehouse. I'd feel pretty good about myself as one of your employees. So that's probably a good story to tell at times. Hey, thanks for being on. I think I could probably have you talk on the subject for hours because I think you got such a great view on this stuff, and I like the way you think through about it. I guess before I let you go, a few things. I like to ask all my guests if they could have a future guest cover a topic for you. What would be something that you'd like to listen to?
Yeah, so something I'm really curious about and only have my experience to say is, how does sprint methodology or Kanban methodology change based on your team dynamics? We have personalities that work well in static versus dynamic environments. And I'm curious to see, how do we ebb and flow with those? A static process or product management process usually ends up failing at some point. So anyone have any insight into that?
That's good. That's a good one. I'm gonna hopefully find somebody to talk about that, because I think I'd actually be interested in hearing it myself. Contact wise, if somebody just wants to reach out to you, talk about anything about the podcast or just in general, what is a good way of getting hold of you?
I mean, I think LinkedIn is probably the easiest way, under Ross Desmond. So take a quick search, and hopefully I'll message you then.
Okay. Yeah, we'll include that in the show notes so that if somebody does want to reach out to you, they can just click through. Ross, thanks for being on. Thanks for sharing. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, man.
Absolutely. That's it for this episode. Be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, if you do know someone or you yourself can speak to the topic that Ross mentioned about how does a sprint or Kanban methodology change with team dynamics, I'd love to know. I think other people would love that episode as well. And secondly, if you found the podcast useful, if it's interesting, share it with somebody that also might like it. That's how we grow. Drop a review someplace where you listen to it. All those things help the podcast organically grow, and I can't thank you enough. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.